Hey, welcome everybody to Relentless Pursuit of Purpose. Tonight, we have a great episode with my friend, Adam Coleman. This is a pre-recorded episode. It's going to be another look at Mr. Brady Goodwin, aka Phanatik's book called There Be Gaslight. For those who may not know, phanatik was a prominent Christian rapper with the Cross movement, I believe one of the founding members. Recently, he declared that he no longer believes Christianity is true and wrote a book to that effect. And so we have been looking at each chapter, going piece by piece and just seeing if the arguments are there and if the arguments hold up. So today I'm joined by Adam Coleman of truid Apologetics, and we'll be looking at chapter 14, Brady Goodwin's book, Let There Be Gaslight. Make sure if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a video or an interview. Our goal is to help you enter into a confirmed, confident, and eternal relationship with the source of all life and purpose. What's up, Mr. Coleman? How you doing?
What's good, bro? What's happening with you?
Ain't much, not much. Yeah, man. Glad to be joined with you again. We've been on several of these together now.
Crazy, right? Yeah. Back to back, baby. We knocking them out here, man. Yeah.
I think this is 12, 13, and 14 we did together.
Yeah. I think that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. We're not playing around, bro. We're not playing around. There's a lot to get to, as you know. Yeah.
And so today, as I said, we'll be looking at chapter 14. Now, in chapter 14, for those who may not know, Mr. Goodwin kind of lays out his feelings about morality or about the moral arguments, kind of gives us some insights to consider. I don't know that he really puts arguments forward, but we're going to look through some of what he said and see if these things hold up. Once again, I should also say this. We're not trying to attack the person of Mr. Goodwin, but as is always the case, if anybody's watched my channel or Adam's channel, arguments put forth deserve to be taken seriously, and if they are found wanting, then it's to everyone's best interest to know the truth. So my organization is called Proof of the Truth. That's all I care about. My goal is not to take down any person, but to take down bad arguments. So with that being said, I got my partner in crime here, the real Adam Coleman.
Y'all know what it is. Yeah.
Amen. So, sir, go ahead and start us off and kind of lay out what you saw as Brady's kind of central thesis or arguments and what you want to say about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is another one of those. I mean, for anybody who's been following this, I mean, they know we did like 2 or 3 shows on chapter 12, like 2 or 3 shows on chapter 13, and chapter 14 is another one of those ones, man, where I think it would take multiple shows to really kind of break down all the qualms that I had with it. And that's like no slight to him. It's just I think there's just a lot of error there, But with respect to this show, I think it would be helpful to just take a look at his what he puts forth as a moral principle, or I'll just say a moral framework. And then, just kind of critique where he's coming from. So at this point in the book, again, we're talking about chapter 14. So at this point, he's already laid out the bulk of his argument as to why he no longer subscribes to Christianity. Essentially, he believes that the Bible is in error with respect to origins, particularly human origins. He believes there's some other problems in the scriptures whereby, we shouldn't take it to be trustworthy. And given that the scriptures aren't trustworthy, he loops, Jesus and Paul in there as also being untrustworthy, and that has real implications, obviously, in terms of the deity of Christ and so on and so forth. So ultimately, he throws the whole Bible out as a witness of God, who God is, and what God is about, pretty much. So that's kind of chapters 1 through 12, and then really 1 through 11, and then kind of tack 12 on there. And then in chapter 13, he goes into what he believes to be some pushback against the some traditional arguments for God's existence. So he tries to get God out of the way, in a sense, by pushing against arguments that would support the notion that God exists. And then, having gotten God out of the way, now we come to chapter 14, where it's like, okay, well, if there is no God, if we can't look to God, or at least the God of the Bible, for some sort of moral framework, then now what? How shall we live? What do we do with the morality question? That's kind of where he is now. So I'm gonna kind of share my screen so we can take a look at what he's put forth, and then we'll kind of go from there. Now, I feel like I'm doing this with every single argument of his. Like before I can even get to the argument, it's like he'll say something else that'll like just kind of trigger me, and so we got to address it first. But
well, I'm glad you pulled this one because I was going to put this, so now I don't have to do it too. So
okay, see there we go. You know, great minds think alike. You know what I mean? So I'm just going to read this. So, well, let me give a context. So before he gets into his own moral theory, you know, he's essentially trying to critique the Christian position. You know, he'll say things like, you know, he believes that morality is obviously not what he calls universal, and he tries to suggest that even you know, morality in the Bible is not universal, and he's essentially at this point he's critiquing the apologists, what he refers to as a presuppositional apologist take or approach to morality and having these kinds of discussions. And so this is what he says on page 321. He says, presuppositional apologists claim that if there is no God, then there could be no universal, absolute, objective morality. Well, all right, I'll get back to that. He also says, I'm inclined to agree, especially if what is meant by that phrase is a code of ethics that is independent of our personal preferences and is the same worldwide and is binding on the consciences of all people, any and everywhere people happen to be. There could not be such a thing without an omnipresent divine author and enforcer of that code. Instead, morality would have to be subjective and social in nature. So I'll camp out there for a second, but definitely off the bat, I mean, like off rip, he's running into some problems. First of all, I think it's interesting, and I feel like I try not to like try to peer into Brady's mind in terms of what he's right. I just try to, you know, go off of what's on the page. But I just found it interesting that he said that presuppositional apologists claim that if there is no God, then there could be no universal, absolute, objective morality. And I just thought that was kind of strange because, you know, obviously, as you know, I don't consider myself to be a hardcore presuppositionalist. I know neither do you. Really, apologists of all stripes, you know, would probably make such an argument that there, at very least, we can say that there is no objective morality. So when he narrows it down to presuppositional apologists, it made me think that, you know, it seems like he has like this narrow view of what apologetics is, maybe what he studied and so on and so forth, that really is centered around his experiences in apologetics. Because I know that with Westminster, they would have been teaching presuppositional, and presumably that's what he would have been teaching as well. So it seemed like he's kind of got this box of what Christianity is and, you know, what apologetics is, and that box centers around his own theological tradition and experiences. But the reality is, it's not just presuppositional apologists that would claim that if there's no God, then you don't have those other things. But you know, any apologist would. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, you know, and we can say more about that. But I've been talking a lot, so you want to slide in here and add some comments, bro?
I definitely agree with you. It's one of the things that stuck out to me as well, which is why we both had that passage kind of highlighted, because to me it stuck out that I'm inclined to agree. So like this is pretty much Christian belief that we ground morality in God. And so if you're inclined to agree that this is what would constitute an objective moral law or code, then what's the problem? Like, I don't, you know what I'm saying? Like, why try to come up with a different moral code or a different moral access to moral code or whatever the moral law might be? If this seems to make sense to you, Mr. Brady, maybe it just makes sense. So I just thought it was an interesting admission right before he then, you know, rebuts all of that admission. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's just really weird to me because I guess, you know, I'm going to read again. He says that I'm inclined to agree, especially if what is meant by that phrase is a code of ethics that is independent of our personal preferences and is the same worldwide and is binding on the consciences of all people, any and everywhere people happen to be. You know, there could be no such thing without an omnipresent divine author and an enforcer of that code. Instead, there would have to be subjective morality would have to be subjective and social in nature. So it's like off the bat, you know, he's giving up on objective morality. And at best, it seems to me that what he does for the rest of the chapter is try to replace it, you know, with some sort of subjective model of morality that I guess maybe affords us I mean, I guess maybe it's kind of like a something's better than nothing approach. You know what I'm saying? Like, let me kind of throw a subjective morality in here, moral framework in here, so that we don't have nothing. You know what I mean? Because the reality is, and I mean, I think he rightly senses this, that if you take God off the table, you're still left with the question of how shall we live? You're still left with the question of how do you navigate these moral impulses and decisions that we have every day? You know what I mean? And so it seems to me he's trying to, he's gotten God out of the picture, at least in his mind, in chapter 13, and that necessitates him having to take on this question, which he does in chapter 14. But with that being said, I think that it's just interesting to me, and this, I think this will come out later. Well, matter of fact, let me just go to the quote if I could. Okay, well, all right. Before I can even, golly, I keep getting tripped up, man. I'm triggered again. Before I can even get to the theory, there was one more thing I wanted to address. I just got to read this. So he makes that comment, and then he immediately goes into this right here. He says, instead, morality would have to be subjective and social in nature. He said theists usually press this point by adding that, quote, if there is no absolute morality, then people could go around taking other people's possessions or even their lives, and no one can say those actions were absolutely wrong. I'm gonna come back to that. He said these types of scare tactics are meant to unnerve the skeptic or atheist enough to change his or her mind, because who would want to live in a kind of world like that? Ideally, the disturbed doubter would then respond with, okay, never mind, you're right. There are some absolutes in the realm of morality, and things like murder and rape are absolutely wrong. Are you happy now? To which the apologist will reply, no, not yet. Not until you tell me how impersonal molecules and matter in a universe that came to be by chance could spawn something like moral absolutes. It can't, can it? Therefore, there must be a God to ground our morality. A conversation that goes this way and this well would mark a very good day for a Christian apologist. Now, this is just more of an irritation point on my on my end, because he says that these types of scare tactics are meant to unnerve the skeptic or atheist enough to change his or her mind. So I mentioned this in the video that we did, or videos that we did, in regard to chapter 13, where there's to me, I think it's a sign of weakness when you straw man a position. Mm-hmm. It suggests to me that you're not confident enough in your own position to face the other person as it is, and face their position as it is, and then engage it. So when you straw man, to me, that's a red flag that, you don't even, I mean, I question if you even believe what you're saying, so this would be an example of that. When a Christian apologist or a philosopher or whatever, when we're pushing back against this notion of, there being, no morality or subjective morality or what have you, it's not a scare tactic. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is not like, I'm not bringing this up. Like, when I say things like, is the Holocaust wrong, or was slavery wrong, or murder and rape, I'm not trying to scare anybody into anything. I'm saying, if you know what you're talking about with respect to ethics and moral philosophy, that any moral theory that's to be taken seriously has to account for all of the data that we encounter in our moral experience, including moral intuitions, right? So when it comes to moral intuitions, just a deep ingrained knowledge of this or that, that this or that is wrong, this or that is right. When people bring out these questions about rape and murder and things like that being absolutely wrong, what we're trying to do is kind of provoke those intuitions. I'm saying we're trying to not provoke. What's the word I'm looking for? We're trying to, in a sense, like put a bead on those intuitions to give rise to the sense, like, what, actually these things really are wrong. These things really are right. It's not a scare tactic. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're trying to draw out is those deeply ingrained moral intuitions into the conversation. Right. And that's like any moral theory is going to have to account for those intuitions as a part of the data set that they're trying to explain. So he does a real disservice to, what he refers to as a presupposition or a Christian apologist by just saying, oh, well, these are just scare tactics to unnerve you. Yeah. Either he has a real misunderstanding of what it is that apologists are doing when they bring these things up. Either he doesn't know what he's talking about in that regard, or he's just being flippant. And in the process of doing so, straw manning what it is that the argument that's really being put on the table. Last thing I'll say, not only are we bringing about the intuitions, or kind of bringing those intuitions to the surface, but also any moral framework. It's kind of like in science, if you have a theory, you want to be able to test it out and see how it works. You know what I'm saying? If you have a hypothesis, rather, you want to test it out, see that it works. It's the same thing in moral philosophy. What you do is, if you have a moral framework, you want to apply it to situations wherein we would have, moral experiences, and see if it cashes out in a rational way. So when we're talking about rape, murder, all those kind of things, again, we're kind of jogging those moral intuitions, and we're also applying somebody's framework to real life situations and saying, okay, well, does the moral framework that you're proposing actually work? Yeah. And so again, at least on 2 counts, I think, maybe I'll just chalk it up to him being flippant, but either way, like, he does a disservice to, these kinds of moral arguments. And I think it's really, he kind of undermines the credibility of his own book in doing so, because you can't really take it seriously.
Yeah, I want to pull something up, but as you say that, doesn't that also miss moral oughtness? Because you can't. How can he ever have an ought in that worldview if it's subjective and if it's not rooted in something transcendent?
Yeah, well, I think he tries, but it doesn't work out too well. I mean, like, because you're right. I mean, if the notion that, and this actually gets to something else I want to say, but when we talk about objective morality, like, we're saying that, as you said, like, we're talking about some source of morality or some grounding. We're pointing to some grounding for morality that's independent of persons, human persons. That's what we're saying. And independent. Well, so a philosopher might say stance independent, meaning it doesn't matter what your opinion is. It doesn't matter like what you think about it. XYZ is right or wrong, just like 2 + 2 = 4. That's what we're talking about when we say objective morality. But subjective morality is just like, if I say that I like chocolate ice cream and you say that you like vanilla ice cream, if we argue about which one is better, I mean, that's clearly stupid, because there is no right answer. You know what I'm saying? It's just a matter of preference. He's talking about applying that sort of a model to morality, that there really is no right or wrong answer, strictly speaking, you know what I'm saying? But nevertheless, it's just like, if you think murder is wrong, it's just like me saying that cabbage is nasty. You know what I mean? Like, it's really, that flavor of making a claim, with respect to morality. So that being said, I thought it was interesting, and I'll leave it here, but he says, if there is no absolute morality, people could go around taking other people's possessions or even lives, and no one could say those actions were absolutely wrong. And he's saying that's something that a Christian apologist might say, and maybe they would, but as far as I know, most Christian apologists wouldn't use that word absolute. They would say something like objective. I'm saying, and philosophically, there's some real differences, because absolute would suggest that XYZ is wrong in every case all the time, you know what I mean? Versus objective, we're just talking about a fixed point of right and wrong. You know what I'm saying? Like some sort of underlying fixed point or anchor of right and wrong. Yeah. And there's a very different in terms of how they cash out, because I can say that killing is wrong, if you're talking about killing indiscriminately, but, killing may not necessarily be wrong if you're talking about saving the life of somebody else. You see what I'm saying? So
absolutely. You remember at the end of the chapter, and I don't know if we'll get here, but when he started talking about altruism and utilitarianism, and especially altruism, and maybe I'll say that for the end, because his comparison with Jesus in that sense was both troubling and confusing. But he kind of puts, to your point, altruism is the highest ethic almost. He also has a line in there that says everything is not always good in every situation, and sometimes you have to know how to adjudicate in different situations. Then the question is, well, who gets to say in those situations if this murder was actually murder or not murder, or if it was okay or not okay? And that's the problem. That's where we are now. And that's literally the issue, is that whoever is the moral arbiter in the situation tends to be the one with the most power or the most guns. That's not a moral law. That's just a gun law. Right. As is the case with many atheists or people who recently become atheists, they'll appeal to Sam Harris or something in line with Sam Harris's kind of atheistic take on how to arrive at morality or at a moral law. But here's one problem, because Brady does appeal to the goal being human flourishing. The question, as is, with a lot of naturalistic theories within the moral or philosophical landscape, is that how do you define human flourishing? And how do you know we're getting closer to it? Because there's no goal, there's no telos in those frameworks. So it's hard, and I'll talk more about this with moral transformation, but that makes it on the one hand, the moral code is just kind of make believe or pragmatic. And on the other hand, even if you kind of disagree with the reality of that, there's a person who exists outside of humanity, at least in Christianity, who transcends humanity, who can properly ground the objective moral code. So off the top, I'm simply saying there's a naturalistic moral a kind of epistemic way to get to morality, and there's a Christian way. In this way, there's a person, and we know moral and ethical laws always apply to persons. So that makes sense, generally thinking. And here there's no person. So it seems, now somebody can say, well, that's just the way it is. Okay, if that's just the way it is, then there is no morality. Let's just say that then, because there's no way to get morality from energy and from random particles, no matter what people want to believe on that. So I want to go kind of more just seeing where are the gaps and what are the things we need to kind of be wary of. G.K. Chesterton said, anytime you get ready to remove a fence, always pause long enough to figure out why it was there in the first place.
Yeah.
You could go to your neighbor's house. They got a big dog in the yard and there's a fence there. You're going to think twice before removing that fence.
Right. Yeah.
And here's the analogy. We are in a society now where we are continually removing fences in our laws, in the way we identify ourselves, in the very idea of what it means to be human. We're throwing out fences such as what it means to be a man or woman, what it means to be human. There's a thing now. It's a real thing.
Otherkins are human. Consciousness is expanding and people are starting to question more, what is a human?
I definitely believe I'm a mermaid.
This lifestyle is kind of like a coloring book where she hands me the lines and I can just fill them in with whatever color I want.
I like to think I'm a 24/7 kitten.
My name is Tony and I'm a human pup.
I'm Andrew. I'm Tony's husband and trainer.
Where people are self-identifying as dogs and cats and other animals.
That's wild. Yeah.
Like, this is the lunacy that we have evolved into. No pun intended.
Right.
And look, the result is just confusion. The result is a true lack of identity. The result is no objective human value. And this is what's crazy. So in the same framework that Brady and Sam Harris and others want to affirm human value, they are part of a system that is unintentionally probably taking away all human value. Because if we're going to say there's nothing unique about being a human or a man or a woman, then what does it actually mean even to be human anymore? It's just like another flavor of ice cream, like you said. Right. And so he made this joke in the book. And I remember doing a video last year on this, and it was kind of ironic that he was saying this against us. Not us, but Christians. Remember that he said, we throw the dart and then draw the dartboard around it. Like, nah,
right.
What atheism is doing. The world throws the dart and then draws the bullseye around it. And in a Christian worldview, there's a target to shoot at. And that's how we know when we missed it. What is sin? Missing the mark. Right now, that's an oversimplification, I know, but that's part of what it is to sin. That's kind of the point. There's a mark we're aiming at called holiness, and we don't hit it. There's no mark to aim at. There is no bullseye in naturalism, scientism. There's no goal.
Hey, can I say something on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Before you go there, because just to further your point, again, like you said, I think that if you read through chapter 14, he presupposes that certain things are goods to be sought after. You know what I'm saying? Human flourishing, or he'll make like little side comments. I don't know if I got the quote up, but he'll make side comments, like if there's a minority of people who are being abused, then people later on down the road would recognize that that's not right. Or, he says something like that, but then he's presupposing things like valuing the minority is a good, you know what I mean? And so it's just stuff like that he presupposes. And the fact of the matter is, doing, again, any form of philosophy, particularly when you're getting into this ethical realm, the question of livability comes up. You know what I'm saying? Like if you have a framework that's not livable, then that's a check mark against that framework. You know what I'm saying? And a framework where you're having to presuppose, really without sound justification, that human flourishing is a good, or these other goods are indeed goods. If you got to presuppose those things without like a really robust account, then essentially you're living after a delusion. You know what I'm saying? Like you're just counting these things as being goods, but on your framework, if anything, they're a delusion or some sort of biological evolutionary product, in your mind. And again, there's no truth value there necessarily. And so I just think that was very interesting. That's a great point that you made. Like, to me, in making those presumptions without giving a grounding for it, to me, it makes his framework all the more unlivable. But we'll see more of it as we go forward. Yeah.
No, absolutely, great point. And with that, it's like when you take a test. Some of us may have to think back a ways, but you take a test in school. Typically, the highest score is 100%. Okay, so if I take a test and I get a 60, I know I did not meet the mark. I know how far away from the mark I am. Let's say it's like a pre-test at the beginning of the year and you take it later. So I got a 60 the first time, and then later in the year I get it at 80. Okay, I'm getting closer to the mark, and I can tell that because there's quantifiable kind of empirical data to show me the progress. The issue of our day is that no one agrees on what that 100% would be. So we don't agree on the goal. And therefore, when it comes to morality, lifestyle, character, all the other things, we're going to have different views on those things because our goals are different, because they're all, like you said, subjective. So what we would need in that worldview, or any worldview, to ground at anything, we would need an objective, unchanging, unmoving, external point of reference to act as our standard. We need something that is not governed by the same things we're governed by. Now, I haven't said God yet, but I'm just saying, like, who could fit that? But who could fit that bill? Who could fit that mold? And so this is, like you said, we're reasoning to the best inference. We're not using scare tactics. Like you said, if every part of your worldview can't be explained, or if every part of this moral framework can't be explained in your worldview, then maybe you need a new worldview. And so I'm simply saying a proper worldview. We're saying that a proper worldview, for it to work right, would need a transcendent moral source, so that they can't be privy to or given to being swayed out of their moral stance. God cannot be swayed out of his moral objective stance. We can, and we all have. And so part of the issue is, for one that doesn't believe in God, and an external and transcendent point of reference is not that you can't be good without knowing God. So we want to be clear too. We're not saying atheists are all bad people and that they can't be good and you got to know God to be good. The issue is that you can never say for sure what good is if there's no God. And that's a different problem. That's a more foundational problem. In other words, we're not saying you can't do these things that are in line with being good, but your idea of the ultimate good is floating in midair if there's no one to attach it to.
No, that's excellent, man. And I wonder if this might be a good point to kind of get into some of the pillars of his moral framework, if you're cool with that,
Absolutely.
Because that definitely speaks to, where I think he's coming from. Let me say this, to your point. Again, the Christian is not saying, that if you're not a Christian, if you don't believe in God, then you can't perform actions that are good, or that you can't identify certain actions that are good or bad or what have you, to your point. And I think that one thing that at least atheists that I've come in contact with, often misconstrue is the fact that there's a difference between having epistemic access to moral truths versus there being moral truths to begin with.
Yeah, like the ontological reality of it.
Thank you. The ontological reality of it. Like, I believe that any, person who, obviously I believe we've been granted rational faculties. And I believe that at least probably most of the time, you can have epistemic access to what's right or wrong, meaning you can know something about what's right or wrong in any given situation. I'm saying that's epistemology is knowledge, or the study of knowledge and how we obtained it. Epistemic access to moral truths, I'm referring to being able to know something about what's right or what's wrong, good, bad, evil, whatever, what I'm saying? And I think that that can't be confused or conflated with, like you said, the ontological reality of what is good, wrong, right, so on and so forth. You know what I mean? And so what Brady does is, again, he's taking objective morality off the table, and then he goes into identifying How can we ascertain certain facts, or I won't say facts, but maybe have some semblance of a moral sense given certain things that are, as I understand them, to be more biological in nature. So let me kind of bring up my screen here, and we'll start to see that. Yeah.
Let me. I want to read this quote by C.S. Lewis. It's a long one, and then I'm just gonna read it and then turn it over to you because it goes.
Cool. Yeah. Do that.
For example, some people wrote to me saying, "Isn't what you call the moral law simply our herd instinct, and hasn't it been developed just like all our other instincts?" How do I not deny that we may have a herd instinct, but that is not what I mean by the moral law? We all know what it feels like to be prompted by instinct. My mother love, sexual instinct, instinct for food. It means that you feel a strong want or desire to act in a certain way. And of course, we sometimes do feel just that sort of desire to help another person. No doubt that desire is due to the herd instinct, but feeling a desire to help is quite different from feeling that you ought to help, whether you want to or not. He says, supposing you hear a cry for help from a man in danger, you'll probably feel two desires. One, a desire to give help due to your herd instinct. The other, a desire to keep out of danger due to the instinct for self-preservation. You'll find inside of you, in addition to these two impulses, a third thing. And here's the key, which tells you that you ought to follow the impulse to help and suppress the impulse to run away. Now, this thing that judges between two instincts, that decides which should be encouraged, cannot itself be either one of them. You might as well say that the sheet of music which tells you at a given moment to play the note on the piano and not another is itself one of the notes on the keyboard. But the moral law tells us the tune we have to play. Our instincts are merely the keys. Another way of seeing that the moral law is not simply one of our moral instincts is this. If two instincts are in conflict and there's nothing in a creature's mind except those two instincts, obviously the stronger of the two must win. But at those moments when we are most conscious of the moral law, it usually seems to be telling us to side with the weaker of the two impulses. Strictly speaking, there are no such thing as good or bad impulses. Think once again of a piano. It doesn't have good two kinds of notes on it, the right keys and the wrong ones. Every single note is right at one time and wrong at another. So the moral law is not any one instinct or set of instincts. It is something what makes a kind of tune, the tune we call goodness or right conduct. By directing the instinct, by the way, the point is of great practical consequence. The most dangerous thing you can do, Mr. Brady, is to take any one impulse of your own nature and set it up as the thing you ought to follow at all costs. Brady says on his book, but what do some of these more unsavory Old Testament laws say about the heart of God? And if they no longer reflect his character, what has changed? Were these laws ever absolute or always arbitrary? All of this is to simply say that as humanity has developed and as societies have progressed, what passes for morality has never been absolute, objective, or universal, but rather has been culturally subjective and has evolved along with us. Here's the last thing I'll say. I'll turn over. So that puts Brady in the position of God, because he can see from this kind of overarching perspective that God had no moral reason for the things he did. And it also implies that what we deem as unsavory is so. But we must have our own moral standard by which to be able to call what God did unsavory. So in essence, we, in Brady's view, become the moral standard that God has to meet. So, red flags.
You're right. Well, and the question could be asked, I mean, like, how reliable is mankind at being some sort of that sort of moral authority? I mean, I think if you look at the history of mankind with all of our, what I refer to as isms, schisms, and wars, we aren't the best, metric, for measuring morality by, we tend to fall short quite a bit, But now I'm glad you read that quote from C.S. Lewis, because that does get into, what it is that I wanted to really highlight about Brady's framework. First of all, let me say this, and this will really, I think this will really kind of flesh out as we talk further. But when it comes to a worldview, the different pieces to your worldview intersect in a way that how you answer certain questions over here affect how you answer questions over there. So for example, when it comes to this notion of anthropology, what is man, right? What are human beings? How you answer that question is going to have major implications for how you navigate moral questions, right? It's actually going to, how you define what man is going to put essentially parameters around the resources that you have at your disposal to answer moral questions, and put it that way. So if you think about Brady in terms of his anthropology, he's already spent 11 chapters or so, essentially claiming that human origins is accounted for by evolution. He's given us a materialist picture of what human beings are. I'm saying we came here, we're here because of evolution, right? That's number one. Number two, in chapter 13, when in his discussion about consciousness, and I'll read this quote here in a little bit, he advocates for understanding human persons and from a materialist viewpoint. I'm saying he argues against this notion of human beings having a soul. In some ways, I feel like he's kind of being funny, but like he leaves the door open for a soul, but basically chalks it up to being like kind of an ancient, fairy tale that we want to keep alive. So he kind of words it that way. You know what I mean? So clearly the lean of his passage is that the data favors our mental faculties and processes being accounted for by physical going-ons in the brain. So between evolution and a materialist picture of human persons, that's going to set some parameters in terms of what can he reach out to now to account for what he calls morality. And so what you see him doing is he appeals to some of the drives and compulsions, if you will, that we get from our biological, I guess, essentially genetics. I'm saying what has Mother Nature gifted us with in terms of our drives, And now I want to say at the outset, so I kind of want to frame it that way. I want to read this here before we get further into his kind of 3/4 pronged principle here. He says, and again, this is kind of picking up on the criticism that he had from for the apologists. He says, but this way of thinking, referring to the apologist way, assumes that in order for morality to be meaningful, it must be objective. First of all, we're not assuming that to be the case. You know what I'm saying? We're not assuming anything. We argue for it. It's not an assumption. And the issue is not about whether or not morality is meaningful or not. The question is it real? Is it a real feature of the is it a feature of reality, right? Is it part of the fixture, the furniture of reality? That's what we're trying to say. But anyway, he said that is like painting with a broad brush upon a canvas that calls for fine, nuanced strokes. Very poetic, but I think, it's pretty empty given his moral framework. Anyway, he says, my contention is that morality can be a universal phenomenon without there being an absolute, universally imparted or received moral code, So now he's giving us, what is his objective? He's telling us outright, he's not trying to give us like a substitute for objective morality in terms of the weightiness of it, its ability to explain our moral experience, I guess kind of a basis of moral obligation. He's not trying to do any of that. All he's trying to do is show that morality can be a universal phenomenon. You know what I'm saying? Meaning something that we encounter wherever persons are. Now, if that's his goal, he's arguing on two different levels from the apologists. I'm saying, because of course I can say that there are shades of morality, of people making moral decisions everywhere we go. Like, that's not all that hard to show. The question is, what are the nature of those experiences? The question is not whether or not can you provide a model that explains, why people may behave in a certain way and attribute morality to it. The more fundamental question is, regardless of why how you explain that part, is there any veridicality? Is there anything veridical about our moral sense? Are our moral impulses and our moral experiences, are they pointing at something real and true or not? That's more fundamental, because if they're not, then it doesn't matter what those the universal moral phenomenon you're describing is. It doesn't really matter, because it's all garbage anyway. It's all illusory. You know what I'm saying, and if this moral phenomenon, this universal phenomenon of morality, as he wants to describe, is ultimately illusory, then it doesn't give us the firm foundation that I think really does justice to the moral experiences that we encounter every day of our lives. And in so much as it doesn't do that, he's then fallen short of giving us something that is really should be given serious consideration as a moral framework. So I think at the outset, he's already off in terms of, where he wants to go there. But before I get into this there, you want to keep going forward into his concept, or do you want to say something there?
No, keep going.
Okay, cool. So I'm not going to read all of this because I would have to read like 5 pages. Actually, it's funny. While I was cutting and pasting or copying and pasting to make these slides, a notification came up on my Kindle account that said that I was reaching the limit that I can copy and paste from this work, which I didn't even know that was a thing. You know what I mean? But I'm trying to take him at his word, so I'm being sure to copy and paste. So I can't be said to take him out of context. But anyway,
that's what we got to do.
Right. So I'll just kind of gloss over this, but at least try to be clear enough so we can see what he's getting at. So he says, perhaps instead of looking for an absolute universal code of conduct, we should adjust our search to try to identify a universal principle of morality. And then he goes on to say, this provides a helpful lens to see how we could have universal morality in principle, yet with individual expression as it relates to the specifics of each culture's code. And so he's not looking for a code, he's looking for a principle. How does he construct this principle? Well, he appeals to principally, tongue in cheek there, two things. One, I might just read the first one. He says, no matter where we look, whenever something like morality is found, there are at least two traits that accompany it, and a third that is often not hard to find. The first is consciousness, or the awareness of self, which produces self-interest. Second is the awareness or acknowledgement of other selves and a sense of interdependency or reciprocity. Third is empathy, or identifying the self with the other. So those are like the three strands of his moral principle, is an awareness of self and awareness of other selves, and there being some sort of reciprocity, or you're like me, therefore, I ought to respect you, or I need you, and therefore we've got to work together, something along those lines. So that's that reciprocity he's talking about. And then empathy, right? So he believes that those are like he says it right here, these inner drives combine to produce self-interest, and whatever aids in the quest to survive and thrive, the self will intuit as good or desirable. This is the first strand. So that's kind of how he defines that. Secondly, however, after differentiating between oneself and others, each conscious individual comes to understand that he or she needs the group, whether it be family, friends, or the broader community, either for companionship, or if not, for some other reason, then to help secure one's basic needs. This leads to the mutually beneficial or reciprocal consideration. So that's the second strand. And then, like I said, he gets into empathy, right? So, as being his third strand. I think that's all I wanted to read there. But he says that, before looking at the third strand of empathy, we can tentatively say morality is the drive to survive and thrive, based on accidentally cut that off. But essentially, it's the drive to thrive and survive. So anyway, I said all that to say you've got three strands that you're working with to, for him, account for a sound subjective moral framework, which is empathy. First, self-awareness, then reciprocity with others, and then you kind of, I guess, like empathy is like the special sauce that takes you beyond just self-interest and interest for others, but maybe brings out altruism and things like that. That's basically what we're working with. So I know there's a lot we could say. Did you want to where you want to go with it first?
There's so many, like you talk about all the time, is about definitions, and definitions matter, man. And like there's no, like we don't have access to his mind, so it's like we're just guessing. But what do you mean by flourish? What do you mean by thrive? What do you mean by survive? Like all these things need deeper understanding, because if a misunderstanding, even on his framework, let's say he's right, but if I misunderstand what he means by survive or thrive, I'm gonna still be out here killing people. Why would that? How is that now helping me survive? There's more resources for me and my family, and I'm surviving. So I know we would say, and I would say too, all atheists aren't out here killing. I'm not saying that's the case. But there's nothing in his moral framework to prevent it from being the case. You know what I'm saying? Like there's no ought in his moral framework to say objectively wrong or right, or that. So yeah, it's not clear what is meant within this framework, or within even when Sam Harris talks about the moral landscape. It's not clear in an objective sense or in a healthy sense what is meant by human flourishing, and what is meant by good, and what is meant by looking out for others, and what is meant by, using each other for our basic needs. Like those things can go off the rail real quick when we're not grounding those terms in something that transcends us. Because my basic need, I could say, is some stuff that other people wouldn't consider basic. And in order for me to fulfill my basic needs, I got to go harm some people, because what I need is some kind of like sexual whatever. That's what I need. So these terms are so nebulous that it's a dangerous it's a dangerous world. This is why Nietzsche, when he said about we've killed God, he understood, even as an atheist, he was like, but there is no up nor down. There is no right or left. Where shall we go? We have no kind of defining parameters. At least he understood the logical conclusion of his nihilistic worldview. And he's honest about it. I don't think it's a pretty picture, but at least he's honest.
Yeah, I mean, he's straight up.
You know,
he's straight up.
So for those who are looking for some resources, maybe even Brady himself, check out God and Cosmos by Baggett and Walls, as well as the Theistic Foundations of Morality. And I'm not saying this is like my go-to or my 100%, but it's going to give you a good framework for understanding certain things, because you brought up something earlier about moral facts. So there's moral facts, there's moral transformation. There's like 4 different categories of even investigation. And so that's the other reason in his chapter here, you didn't touch any of them. And so that's why I'm like, did you really engage with all the material? Because this is not hard to find.
That's a great point. And to your point, I got Bagging the Walls right here. Good God, Theistic Foundation Morality. That's the one you was referencing. Yeah, I got the same joint. You know what I mean? And to your point, what they're getting into there is not just whether or not there are moral facts, you know what I'm saying? But also they get into like blameworthiness, whether it be guilt or whether it be giving moral accolades, like you said, moral transformation, all of those things. There are various facets to our moral experience that need a coherent explanation, not just the question about objective morality. Now, to be fair, typically most apologists kind of camp out there that objective or not question, but there's so much more to it. It does make you wonder, like, how much time did he spend, with those kinds of resources? Yeah.
And so with that, I'm just going to touch one of them, which is moral transformation. Because like you said, like there's so much to talk about. We can't do it all. Even if I was just going to teach on all 4 of those, I couldn't do it in an hour.
Right.
And so I'm kind of giving this because he didn't address any 4 of them at all in the whole chapter on morality. Maybe in chapter 15 is, I don't know. Let's just think about this thought experiment with moral transformation. If we remove God from the equation as the foundation upon which we ground and build our life, a lot of things get left in limbo. So today we're talking about morality specifically, but also left in limbo is happiness, the meaning of life. There's a lot of other casualties when you take God out the picture. But let's just talk about moral transformation. So I would say naturalism lacks the means, as we've shown, as Adam's shown, to ground a moral law. It cannot fulfill the desire one has to grow or become more moral either. And here's the reason. If transformation is the goal, there has to be a telos or a purpose, which is kind of what telos means. In other words, whether transformation has taken place can't be accurately assessed unless there's a target to aim at. So we're back to the bullseye and having an actual target to shoot at and not just drawing around our arrow. Naturalism cannot tell a man where to direct his moral growth. So therefore, he never knows if he arrives. So Baggett and Walls write, despite the prodigious efforts of some secularists to retain the category of a human telos, Daniel Dennett assumes that on naturalism, all ultimate explanations must be mechanistic, so that the theological, where it occurs, must be explained in mechanistic terms. And this is potentially question begging on his part, but it is also just where the theist would demur and reverse the order. So without a goal, naturalistic moral transformation is reduced to moral pragmatism. And Brady even kind of alludes to that in the book, but this is kind of where every naturalistic moral framework leaves off, whether they admit it or not, because a constantly shifting goalpost further impacts any process of moral transformation. So what some people used to consider morally acceptable 200 years ago, i.e. slavery, is no longer deemed morally acceptable. Now, while this is a valid and life-affirming change, it demonstrates that the moral code written by men and nations is anything but objective. And I believe even Brady makes that point as well. But here's the conclusion that he doesn't make. This leaves morality, meaning, happiness, everything with its feet firmly planted in midair. There's no attachment to anything real. And therefore, you can never say in a purely naturalistic framework, if I'm becoming more moral, becoming a better person, becoming more aligned with the good, because those are targets, those are bullseyes that don't exist in that framework. So moral transformation is not impossible to take place in naturalism. It's just impossible to track. And really, if you're doing transformation without tracking it, you don't really know if you're doing it.
Message.
So like in football, you know, the goal is the end zone. Without the end zone, what's the game for? Like, what are we doing here?
Right. No, that's facts, bro. And, you know, I want to kind of, if I could add on to that, man. Forgive me, I had to step aside to go fuss with my kids. They was being like super loud. My bad. You know. But you know, I know your audience probably familiar. If they're familiar with me, they know what's up with that anyway. Y'all got like bad kids out here, you know, at the crib. But anyway, when it comes to, I'm thinking about like African American history, you know, and heritage, right? Dr. King, in terms of his public impact, Ida B. Wells, you know, Frederick Douglass, you know, Harriet Tubman, any of our freedom fighters, you know, that we want to name. Why are they historically significant? You know, they're historically significant because they're morally significant, right? So much of our history, in terms of like our heroes, are indeed heroes because they did something heroic from a moral standpoint, right? So when it comes to if moral transformation can't be properly tracked, I'm saying, or is illusory in some sense, if it's like essentially a moral illusion, then think about what that does to, you know, the heritage. It was pretty. I'm just going to stick in the African American context. Like, you know, what Dr. King did really isn't all that impressive. You know what I'm saying? Because there is no such thing as real moral transformation. Again, Harriet Tubman or anybody else that we want to name, like none of those things are really morally significant in terms of having brought about some sort of transportation. There really was no actual good or evil. You know, they weren't fighting against any evil because there's really no evil for them to fight against. You know what I'm saying? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, you know, depending on your moral framework, like when you think about something that Brady's putting forth, it really sucks the life out of the meaningfulness of some of these figures. You know what I'm saying, and things that we find meaning in.
Can you touch on this too? Let me ask you a question. So, because C.S. Lewis, he talked about that third law, which adjudicates between the two, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in those same situations, you're talking about King and others. I mean, I would say their entire push or locus of moral operation, if you will, was appealing to that third thing, right? Like,
yeah, that's right.
They're basically saying this laws on earth ain't cutting it for anybody, but there's a higher law that we're appealing to for all of us, right?
That's right. Yeah, and I mean, even I'm thinking about like some of the trials against, some Nazi soldiers and so forth. Like when they were, you know, tried in international court, like it was exactly those kinds of concepts. Like, you know, you even have statements of those who were adjudicating those cases. We're appealing to a higher law. You know what I'm saying? There's a law above, you know, what the Fuhrer said was okay. You know what I mean? And you ought to have obeyed it. You know, is those kinds of things. And so to your point, if you don't have that higher law, and we're just talking about subjective morality, then, you know, Dr. King wasn't really right. You know, as a matter of fact, I could argue that he might have been, pragmatically speaking, he might have been wrong. Harriet Tubman might have been wrong, from the standpoint that when you look at, you know, in Brady's book, he kind of flirts with utilitarianism, and actually, I think even more than flirts with. I mean, he actually incorporates it into his overall framework. But this notion of doing the most good for the most number of people. Now, granted, when you kind of bring that model into, if you don't have this higher law like you're talking about, and we're just kind of figuring out how do we bring about the best good for the most amount of people, shoot, maybe slavery was right. When you think about it, you know, like, from that point, you could argue that there were more Europeans and, you know, even if you want to say African Americans today who benefited from the prosperity brought about through slavery. I mean, you know, certainly more people have financially benefited from it, as, you know, living in this country right now than those who suffered under it, you know, in terms of those who were actually enslaved. So we're going to talk about, you know, doing the good for the most people, the most good for the most people. If we want to play a numbers game, more people have benefited from slavery than those who were subjected to slavery worldwide, as a matter of fact, because as a worldwide power, America has, you know, contributed, you know, aid to various different countries and so on and so forth. So if we just want to play a numbers game, you know, like kind of a utilitarian game, I can say that, you know what, daggone it, man, Harriet Tubman was tripping. She should have just let cats stay enslaved and just like, yo, it's serving the greater good, because, you know, on the backs of those slaves, you know, yeah, they took an L, but a lot more people were going to benefit. You know what I mean? Now, he was saying in his book that, yeah, you know, later generations would frown upon that and recognize that maybe there's something wrong there. But who cares what later generations think? Because there's no objective morality anyway. They're neither right nor wrong either. Those people who would sneer at it. So you have all these questions. And then let me say this too, with utilitarianism, it's not entirely clear on how to even calculate, bringing about the most good. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like, it's not like if you can just kind of numerically chalk up how many people benefit and then just leverage that against those who lose out, because then you lose the moral significance of the individual, for the sake of the group. But then you also lose the moral significance of the lesser group, those who are lesser in number. Even though they might endure a greater moral peril, I'm saying, as opposed to the moral good that somebody else might get. Like, all those things are very complicated, which is why, many people argue against utilitarianism, flatly speaking, as a basis for morality. But to your point, having understanding the reality of this overarching moral law, the one to which Dr. King appealed to and other people that I've named, that right there gives you a vantage point from which to make real moral claims. To see real moral transformation, you know what I'm saying, and make real moral progress. I think it seems to me that, and I'm about to make another comment here in a second, but I'll pause here. But just for those reasons, Brady's tapestry of morality begins to fall apart.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, it does. So Malcolm Mugridge said that the depravity of man is at once the most empirically verifiable reality, but at the same time, the most intellectually resisted fact. And the reality is that sin, even for those who want to attempt to deny its reality or minimize it or rename it, the presence as well as the effects of sin and depravity cannot be ignored or called into question. And this is actually why any alternate moral framework even needs to exist. Because if we didn't have the issue of sin, we wouldn't need any necessary moral framework, whether it's the Christian one or something that Brady is proposing. But let me take it a step further. I'll let Mr. Mugridge take it a step further when he says, so the final conclusion would surely be that whereas other civilizations have been brought down by attacks of barbarians from without, ours had the unique distinction of training its own destroyers at its own educational institutions, and then providing them with facilities for propagating their destructive ideology far and wide, all at the public expense. Thus did Western man decide to abolish himself, creating his own boredom out of his own affluence, his own vulnerability out of his own strength, his own impotence out of his own erotomania, himself blowing the trumpet that brought the walls of his city tumbling down, and having convinced himself that he was too numerous, labored with pill and scalpel and syringe to make himself fewer, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility and polluted and drugged himself into stupefaction, he kneeled over a weary, battered old brontosaurus and became extinct. It's a pretty picture, right?
Right.
What Mr. Mugridge is alluding to is that we're, with this type of moral framework that Brady is espousing, we're going to do ourselves in. It's not going to be some external factor that comes in and we're destroying ourselves, and we're watching it happen. And I talked about like the slow, slippery slope of removing that objective, transcendent source for everything, not just moral framework, but for meaning for everything else, to the point that we don't know who we are. We don't know what we are. And it's not everybody. But the fact that we're even talking about what it is to be a man or woman or human is alarming. And it is indicative of this part here. He says, our society had the unique distinction of training its own destroyers. These kids are learning these things in school and in social media and pop culture and wherever else. We're training, people are being trained through vacuous ideologies away from truth. And whenever you're not on the side of truth, it doesn't end well. So Adam and I are sounding the alarm. If anything, it's like, yo, this is not just a disagreement. This has real terrible implications if we keep going down this type of thinking street. So I just want to put that out there. And this also is why I want to get into this little exegetical problems that Mr. Goodwin has, that this is where it got really sloppy for me. And he tries to basically impugn God at this point. And there's your quote there. So he says, and even in the Bible, Psalm 137:9, the writer delights in the Lord at the thought of dashing infants against rocks. Granted, this was in revenge for what was done to Israel, but did the consciences of people in either culture convict them about the absolute, universal, and objective immorality of such deeds? Or were they men and women of their time with the morals of their time? Well, yeah, you're just asking the wrong questions even there. So first and foremost, we have to understand the difference between descriptive and prescriptive passages. Now, I don't know how you don't learn this in seminary, which I would have to guess you did. Just because something's
especially at Westminster, I would think so. Yeah.
You know, like just because something's in the scripture does not mean God is saying do X, Y, Z. So if we look at, I don't know if I put the actual text. Yeah. So the end of that psalm, it says, daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is the one who pays you back what you've done to us. Happy is he who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rocks. And this is what Mr. Goodwin is alluding to. But in context, if you understand it, like at the beginning of that psalm in most Bibles, the title of that psalm is a lament of the exiles. So the framework for what was written and who wrote it and why is a lament of people who have been captured and taken captive and had their lands robbed and gone through that type of a barbaric situation. And now, as with any of us do, we're writing out or we're crying out like, God, like get them, like, man, you see what they did to us? Doesn't mean God's going to do it. And it doesn't mean that it's right to do, but it also definitely doesn't mean God said this or God wants to do this. That's just terrible exegesis. So I'm going to move kind of quickly through these. He says this one for Ezekiel 20, 25, 26. He says, in this we read that God himself admits that he gave Israel rules that were not good by making them offer up their firstborn sons. So much for the defense that they were only meant to be circumcised or temple servants. God's commands are not all good, even in his own eyes.
Yeah, that one stuck out to me too. But yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in context, it says, also, I raised my hand in an oath to those in the wilderness that I would scatter them among the Gentiles and disperse them throughout the countries. This is God talking. Because they had not executed my judgments, but had despised my statutes, profaned my Sabbaths, and their eyes were fixed on their fathers' idols. So here's a charge against this group of people. Then it says, therefore. Now, I was always taught, y'all probably heard this before, always ask, what's the therefore, right? So the therefore is there for us to understand why or what's the repercussions for this disobedience. Therefore, I also gave them up to statutes that were not good. I gave them up. It's just like in Romans 1, I turned them over to reprobate mind. It's their choosing, and I let them have their choice. And judgments by which they could not live, and I pronounced them unclean because of their ritual gifts, in that they caused all their firstborn to pass through the fire, that I might make them desolate, and that they might know that I am the Lord. Now, people got to understand what's happening. God was not condoning child sacrifice. He was rebuking it. That's the point of the scripture. The Israelites had engaged in some of these practices along with their neighbors, the Canaanites, who were already doing this stuff. And then Israel started doing some of this. And God, so it's kind of like, what if God didn't judge them? What if God didn't check them? Then we'd be mad at God for not doing that. Like, you can never win with some of these atheistic groups, right?
Well, yeah, I want to add on something too, because I'm glad you brought that up. And I might actually end up doing a whole show on this, man. But to your point, when it comes to verse 25, there's some translations that will say, that I gave him, it's the Lord speaking. It says, I gave them statutes that were not good. And that's what he's referencing.
Yeah.
And let me explain, in the version you have here, let me give an example as to why some of the translators would render it, therefore I gave them up to statutes that were not good. Because if you look at, to your point, we see throughout the scriptures, really, one of the main forms of judgment against a person or people is when God gives them over to their sinful desires. It's like, all right, cool. Y'all want to ride like that? Peace. I mean, I'm going to turn you over to, your sinful desires, i.e., the book of Romans and so forth. Right. And so perfect example, the question then would be like, why should we interpret verse 25 in light of that? And I think that you find credence to that or reason rather to do so in verse 39, because he says in chapter 20, so the same chapter, just further down, he says in verse 39, as he's still laying out, judgment, he said, as for you, people of Israel, this is what the sovereign Lord says, go and serve your idols, every one of you. But afterward, you will surely listen to me and no longer profane my holy name with your gifts and idols. You see what I'm saying? Let me read it again. Verse 39. As for you, people of Israel, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Go and serve your idols, every one of you. But afterward, you will surely listen to me and no longer profane my holy name with your gifts and idols. Now, clearly what we see here, like, does God want them to go worship idols? Obviously not, because he's been commanding them not to do so the whole time. You know what I mean? But, obviously they continue to press on and serve the idols and profane his holy name. So he's like, all right, cool. Go ahead and serve your idols. That's what I'm telling you. Do you. And what it's going to happen is you're going to mess yourself up, and then you're going to listen to me and realize that we shouldn't be profaning his holy name. Like that's literally what God is saying.
Yeah.
So again, coming back up to verse 25, I think if we interpret in light of verse Ezekiel 20:39, the same chapter, along with the concert of scripture, seeing how God turns people over to their own sins and desires and the consequences thereof, it's easy then to look at verse 25 and not take such an uncharitable view of it, like I think Brady does, but see that this is a case again of God saying, okay, cool, y'all want to wild out. I mean, and then when you continue to desecrate yourselves before me, then you're gonna realize that we need to do it God's way. Clearly, I think that's what God is saying there.
Absolutely. And the last one, he messed me up with this because Psalm 119 is my favorite, and he tried to come for it.
Psalm 119.
So I'm gonna read it. He says on page 327, Psalm 119 is a popular passage that praises the laws and statutes of the Lord. According to verse 3, the one who does what is written in God's law does no wrong. One can keep his feet from evil by following God's laws, verse 101. The statutes God has laid down are wonderful, verse 129, and fully trustworthy, verse 138. This psalm is often held up as an ideal for Bible believers who claim or aim to love God's law just as much as the psalmist, yet not many today would advocate for the enactment of the above laws from Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Now, don't want to get into every type of law and breaking down all the laws and what laws we follow and not, and we've done that before. But he goes on to say, as Rodney Stark points out, the New Testament depiction of Jesus humanized Yahweh and made the ancient God more accessible and comforting and less incomprehensible and forbidding. And the irony of saying that is he still doesn't comprehend even Jesus in the New Testament accurately, or feel that there's any forbidding going on, or that there should be. And so there's uniformity when we really look and do a deep dive of quote unquote the God of the Old Testament and New Testament. They're the same God, same principles, and the law, as is indicated by Jesus, is still good, still valid. Which parts of the Levitical law we keep in our lives at this point, that's a whole separate story. But in the essence of what's in Psalm 119, all of it is true. And the other reason it's true, that obviously Brady's already he feels he's debunked in previous chapters, is that because Psalm 119 is all about the word, it's also all about Jesus. And so these are not just things that is saying that the law is good for. These are things that Jesus being the word and Jesus being the truth, he is the embodiment, the fulfillment, as it says in Matthew, of the law. And therefore, in that way, all those things, following that law, following God's word, following God's moral standard is good because he's good.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that too and say that I do think that he kind of plays on a common misconception about the New Testament, Jesus in terms of his earthly ministry, I should say, and then also the New Testament, because people, I think wrongly, think that it's essentially painting a different picture of Yahweh. But when you think about it, clearly the centerpiece of the New Testament is the crucifixion and the resurrection. The crucifixion was God pouring out his wrath in light of his judgment. You know what I'm saying? Nobody got off the hook. Jesus took the full brunt of the wrath of God. So again, the centerpiece of the New Testament revolves around, or at least incorporates, alludes to God's wrath. That's number one. Number two, when you think about Ananias and Sapphira, they dropped dead in the presence of the Holy Spirit because they lied. You know what I mean? It was, and they took a major L. You know what I mean? Demonstrating that, hey, with this new, kind of the inbreaking of the kingdom in this form, God is still not playing. He's still not joking around. You can still take that L if you want to mess around. I mean. Lastly, the book of Revelation. I don't know how you can read the book of Revelation and think that God is trying to soften himself, because this is the same Jesus who's coming back, handing out beatings. You know what I'm saying? To everybody. You know what I'm saying? It's going to be, it talks about the blood will be up to the horse's bridle and so on and so forth on that fearful day of the Lord. Like, God's coming back for judgment. Like, it's not a game. So he's kind of playing on, I think, a misconception of, Jesus is meek and lowly at heart, but he's also not going to play when it comes to sin and what like that. Ain't nothing changed with respect to, his moral nature and, the reality of judgment, you know what I'm saying, one way or the other. So anyway, hey, can I show my screen? I got one more thing I wanted to, share, and then we can roll up out of here, man. You got a meat sandwich here for your for your audience. So again, like I talked about earlier, when it comes to moral questions, the concepts and what you have at your disposal to investigate and understand moral questions is in some way going to be dictated by how you answer other questions, i.e. anthropology. What is man? We already talked about when it comes to answering the questions about what man is. Brady has expressed, it's like the majority of his book, that he believes that we are we come up at the tail end of this evolutionary story. We are products of evolution. Number one. Number two, he argues against, this notion of a soul, and argues for, by implication, for there being a materialist picture of human beings. We're just a physical brain, no soul, and so forth. That's the kind of the trajectory of his argument in chapter 13. So we're products of evolution, and we're just material persons. I'm saying we don't have a soul. All right, with those things in mind, by the time we get to him engaging in these moral questions, he's trying to build upon that. And he's saying, okay, well, we've got these, our evolutionary history, if you will, has programmed us, with these compulsions for, we have this ability and we're compelled to acknowledge our own self-interest, right? We have the capacity and are naturally inclined, if you will, to acknowledge other selves. So we have self-interest, and then this kind of reciprocal, relationship with others, kind of I scratch your back, you scratch mine, because we're kind of similar, that sort of reciprocity. That's the second piece. And then we have empathy, which is, this notion of caring for others, essentially. Right now, here's the problem. Here's the problem with the three-strand cord that he's given us. If naturalism is true, saying if it is the case that we are products of evolution, and if it is the case that we do not have souls and are merely physical beings, then I think that those two concepts cut the legs from under all three of those pillars of his moral theory: the empathy, the self-interest, and the reciprocity. And here's why. We can look at what's called physical determinism. That's like if we are all products of evolution, and again, we're just, human persons are just the physical brain, because he believes, according to chapter, what he says in chapter 13, that, our mental faculties and processes are attributable to the neurons and so forth in the brain. If that's true, then we have at least two types of problems when it comes to physical determinism, because we're just made of physical stuff. Number one, physical material, you run into determinism on what we can call a bottom up level. Okay. So whatever's going on at, we can call it the macro level, us having bodies and, planets and everything else, really can be reduced to the activities that are going on at the most fundamental level of physical reality: electrons, neutrons, quarks, whatever the smallest bits of physical reality are. It's really the activity going on in that quantum level that dictates what happens at the upper level, right? Now, obviously, if that's the case, then we run into a problem, because we don't have any capacity for moral reasoning at the quantum level. I'm saying, the quarks aren't reasoning, right? Electrons, there's no good reason to think that quarks and electrons are doing any sort of reasoning. And there's certainly no good reason to think that that they're doing any reasoning in concert with one another, such that it represents in any way what goes on in our minds. We have to keep in mind that morality is a rational process. You know what I'm saying? Well, engaging in morality, rather, I should say, is a rational process. When you encounter a moral situation, you're saying, okay, there's some facts of the matter here going around this particular behavior or this particular instance, from which I'm going to draw a moral conclusion, or whether something is right or wrong. There's moral reasoning going on. But if our reasoning is really attributable to what's going on at the basic fundamental level of physical reality, that quantum level, then there's no good reason to trust our reason, our moral reason. Because really everything that's going on in our minds is just a product of what's happening at that fundamental physical level. I kind of talked about this, I think, in our previous show. Second, when it comes to determinism, if it is the case that we're just physical beings, then really whatever happens at one instant essentially determines what happens at instant 2, 3, 4, and 5. I'm saying, like, whatever's going on in the past on a physical level determines what's going to happen later on a physical level, including the physical matter of our mind. So really, we're not making responses to moral realities. All we're doing is regurgitating or producing or somehow living out what the physical matter in our minds gives us based upon physical things that have happened in the past. There's a disconnect between our rational faculties and the moral questions that we encounter. And that disconnect is the only thing that's going on up here is physical happenings rather than really engaging moral realities. Lastly, when it comes to evolution, so that just follows from physical determinism, those two problems right there. But then thirdly, when it comes to evolution don't care nothing about morality. Evolution is about survival.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? If anything, you can say morality is a byproduct. But if our impulses are given to us by evolution, then number one, we're more so just like evolutionary robots. There's no good reason to think that we can trust our senses to really yield truths, because evolution is not about truth. It's about survival. And so it could be that there are moral truths out there that we're just missing the mark because we've been programmed by evolution. You know what I mean? Like there's just no good reason to think that beyond that which is absolutely necessary for survival, we can really have, anything veridical in our thoughts, and minds with respect to morality. So at least on 3 levels, I think that he runs into some problems. Again, if we're just physical beings, then everything going on in our minds is a product of what's happening at the most fundamental level of physical reality. Number 2, anything going on in our minds is kind of a domino falling from something that happened in the past, because it's just physical dominoes falling. That's all that really happens in reality, at least the physical universe. And 3, we have good reason to not trust our senses to really be robustly truth yielding with respect to morality, given that evolutionary is unguided and not geared at truth, particularly moral truth, but rather just survival. So if all those things are true, then not only do when it comes to the empathy, the self-interest, the self-awareness, all of those things are just products of these physical processes that I've been talking about, and there's no really good reason to put stock in them as being reliably able to lead us to moral truths. Lastly, I would say that even if you take that approach, you still end up with an is-ought problem. Just because it is the case that we are self-aware, aware of others, and have empathy, doesn't mean that it ought to be the case that we should make moral judgments based upon it, or that we ought to follow those compulsions. He tries to address this in chapter, I think, 15, by saying that, even though there's an is-ought problem, we can just attribute, we can resolve that by saying that we have sentiments or passions to do the right thing, and that kind of fills in the gap of the is-ought problem. But it doesn't, because if we're just physical beings, on physical determinism, those passions are just products of the physical going on in the brain anyway. So none of that really matters. It's all illusory. The passions, the sentiments, the empathy, the self-awareness, the awareness of others, all of those things are illusory and just products of evolution and physical going-ons in the brain. And if you really believe that that's the foundation of morality, then you don't really have much to say about what physical determinism has produced in somebody else in terms of, maybe they're an axe murderer or something like that. I mean,
what if somebody has different passions?
Right. Yeah. What can you say about it? So at least on 4 counts, I think that he's given us a moral framework that he says accounts for there being universality in terms of our moral experience. And I'm just saying that even if you want to claim that, I'm going to try to bite my tongue here. I don't want to say something super offensive, but you certainly haven't given anybody who's interested in real morality and really understanding the moral experience, you haven't given them anything to chew on, and certainly haven't given them anything that explains the moral experience or provides a better explanation than Christian theism.
Man, amen to all that, man. But I want to finish with this one on the altruism, which, like I said, that he's positing this is kind of like the highest ethic. And on page 335, he says, but altruism is produced by full-grown empathy in the face of a threat. The result is an interest in the principle of selves in general, even at the expense of the individual self. Off the top, I was like, I can think of somebody who did that in real life, namely Jesus. But it's ironic that he thinks that that's like the highest level, and that's what Jesus did. Yet he don't want to give Jesus his props. Be that as it may. But then he tries to right. And then he tries to compare Jesus's altruism to how our cells, he says, are relinquish their individuality to become parts of a greater whole. I'm like, bruh, cells are not choosing to lay down their life.
Right.
Like, what are you talking about?
Right.
Come on, man.
It's so bad, man. Because I think he was. I guess he was trying to use it as an analogy, but to me, it seems like I want to say it's the right word is reification, where he's applying to the cells some sort of trait or attribute that they really don't have. You know what I mean? Right. But you're right. I mean, they're not relinquishing anything to become part of a greater whole. You know, but if they are, they're just as determined as we are. I mean, like, we're no different in the sense that it's all physical determinism anyway, which is morally blind, or so. Yeah, it's bad, bro. Yeah.
But listen, man, I think that's all I got. There's more that we could say, y'all. And once again, if Mr. Goodwin, if you do see this, just know that we took our time. We read the book. We went through the arguments. Our refutations stand. And we feel like they stand on good ground. We've cited all the evidence sources, and we could do more. But at the end of the day, the real goal, the hope is that, yes, that Mr. Goodwin will kind of recant or change, but also for everyone watching to know that we stand on good ground, morally, epistemically, on every other category you want to break it down on. Christian theism stands on good ground, solid ground, objective ground. And for that reason, we can trust it, and we can trust the person at the center of it. So, my man, Adam, what you want to say as we close out?
Hey, man, once again, I appreciate you having me, bro. Apologize for those pauses. I have to go fuss with my kids, but they was wilding, you know what I mean?
It's all good.
I had to go morally instruct them real quick, you know what I mean? But no, man, it's always fun, man. I appreciate you having me on, man. And again, this is not like a hate-filled kind of a thing. Like, this is not something where, we just enjoy, beating somebody down with information or whatever, It really is. My hope is that people will watch this and not be taken in by deception. I hope that for Brady's sake that he reconsiders a lot of what he believed to have been true. He came to some conclusions, I think, rather hastily. And I hope that he, recognize, like, hey, bro, like, you missed a spot. You know what I mean? And maybe he'll go back and take a look and do some things differently. You know what I mean? But definitely, I agree with you. Just want to second everything you said. Like, I mean, we do have rational grounds for Christianity and all of its implications, and I think that I hope that we've explored that, at least with respect to morality here today, man. So y'all check me out, on the truid podcast, the truid apologetics YouTube channel. I've got some more responses to come. I got at least 2 or 3 coming down the pike, man. So, this is the gift that keeps on giving. So we're going to keep on giving it. You know what I mean? So
yes, sir.
There you go.
All right, y'all. Until next time, peace.